Welcome back. We're talking about walls. Do they keep citizens safe or are they just keeping people apart? Joining me for this part of the show from Denver, Thomas Fry is a futurist speaker and executive director of the Da Vinci Institute. And with me here in the studio is Ali Al-Ahmed, founder and director of the Institute for Gulf Affairs. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Ali, let me start with you. It seems that more and more countries around the world are looking to the construction of walls, of barriers, for a variety of reasons, you know, to control immigration, illegal immigration, I should say, to control illegal cross-border movements and to counter terrorism. Saudi Arabia has just resorted to that solution. What can you tell us about that?
Well, Saudi Arabia has walls against its border with Iraq, and also it started for many years now to build a wall and demilitarized zone with Yemen. So governments in the world, you know, or population in the world have started from the early age of humanities to build these walls to protect themselves against outsiders and sometimes to protect their citizens from leaving that big prison in a way. So this is nothing new. We see it now with the advances of fast, transportation of humans through airlines and through ships. More walls are being built and more barriers for human movement because governments feel that they need to control who crosses their border.
And of course, you know, we just heard in that first part of the show, the wall that's been constructed between the Palestinian occupied territories and Israel. And the impact that has on the lives. And sometimes we forget that there is another barrier, and that, of course, is the barrier between another occupied territory, Gaza, and Egypt.
Yes, and I think that barrier is probably the most talked about in the Middle East because is a lot of stories talking about people dying there, not being allowed to enter Egypt for medical reasons. People need goods because Gaza is under somewhat a siege to prevent goods and people movement. So this is an example of how politics sometimes deprives people from moving just because they live in a geographical area, although they do not pose a security or economic threat.
Let's go to Thomas Fry in Denver. And Thomas, doesn't it seem a little bit of an anomaly that in this day and age, when we talk about globalization, that we see more barriers going up?
Yeah, this is a complicated issue. On one hand, we're becoming a much more fluid society. We have more modes of transportation, easier to get around than ever before. And so we're starting to see more migration of people because it's easier to move around. So while on one hand, we're creating borderless economies, on the other hand, it becomes easier to manage a population if it's relatively static. And so rather than, I mean, if you have an extra 1,000 or 100,000 people move into your community, that becomes rather difficult to manage those extra people in there. But keep in mind, it's from an economic standpoint, people create the economy. And so it's beneficial on a lot of levels to have a bigger population, but if it's the wrong type of people, then we run into issues.
Do we know if, Thomas, if any of these walls, or at least the reasons for building these walls, I mean, is it mainly because governments want to prevent terrorist attacks, or is it mainly to stop, I guess, what is called economic migration?
I don't think anybody's interested in economic migration, preventing that from happening. But from bringing the wrong type of people in. But once you build a wall, it takes on characteristics that were never intended. So the building of walls actually it's a symbolic, very expensive piece of infrastructure. Once it's there, it's very hard to get rid of. You create these reinforcement mechanisms. There's people that are maintaining the wall. There are people that are monitoring the wall. There's lots of activity that goes on. And so the wall itself creates an economy, and that holds it in place for far longer than people want. With all the modern new technology, we actually have ways of creating borderless economy, or borderless invisible walls, if you will, that you can electronically monitor all the comings and goings of people without having to build a physical structure there. So there's some advantages in doing that, but it is a complicated issue, so there's no one-size-fits-all solution to this.
Right, Ali, you were telling us about the walls that Saudi Arabia have constructed on the border with Iraq, on the border with Yemen. Tunisia is going to build a wall to keep people from Libya coming into Tunisia. And as you pointed out to me during the break, there was a wall a long time ago that was created between Libya and Egypt.
Yes, during the uprising of the Libyans against the Italian colonial powers over Libya, the Italians built this barbed wire from the Mediterranean all the way to the Great Sahara, really, to divide Libya from Egypt, where they used to get procure weapons to fight the Italians. So, of course, that's now past of history. So the idea that governments build walls is really now, I think, it's a greater frequency, because now it's easier for us to move, and there is a greater polarization. If you compare, for example, the situation in Africa, this is the greatest migration now to Europe. The Europeans feel that they are basically they've been swarmed by a lot of African migrants, so they need to build some kind of a defense mechanism to control the new population. In this day and age, the more the government has advanced technology, they are involved in our lives greater than before. So they want to control who enters the country. You need a visa. If you cannot get a visa, you need to smuggle yourself in a boat or something. So I think we will see greater number of walls, visible and invisible walls, in the future, because the greater the state is powerful, the greater their desire to control movements and anything else.
Yeah, I guess the point is, though, are the governments successful in achieving their aims by constructing these barriers?
I think somewhat they are successful, but it doesn't really stop the movement. It's very much, the human movement has not stopped since the beginning of humanity. So I think it will reduce the number, but what do you do with 2,000 people coming from Africa on boats, or coming from Asia to Australia? It's very hard to stop. Or people coming from Latin America into the United States. It's really hard to deal with. The laws, unless you solve the economic imbalance, unless you solve these crises sometimes that created by the stronger governments in Europe and the United States and the West in general, I think we will continue to see migration, and economic migration, and also migration because of wars. Now we witness the Syrian crisis, and its effect is very clear on the migration movement around the world.
Thomas, you are a futurist. You are one of a group of people that looks at long-term trends, future trends. Will we see more walls going up in the times ahead, or will we see a greater flow of human beings across borders?
I think we'll probably see a momentary blip where we're starting to build more walls, but to change the migration from Africa to Europe, building a better economy in Africa would suddenly eliminate a lot of the incentive for making that trip. On the same hand, the people that are taking the initiative, that are wanting to find a better life, these are the ambitious people. They're the ones that have the drive and ambition to do something different. These are actually the people that you should want in your country, which goes counter to a lot of the thinking that these are just desperate people that are trying to get in to make a killing off of what we earn in our country. That it actually is a little different than that. So while we might have this momentary blip in building these walls, we will find there's a lot greater advantage to actually creating borderless societies and being able to collaborate rather than to be so competitive in all these areas.
Right, and that's something we heard from the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon at the beginning of the program. Ali, you want to say something?
Yeah, something today, the UN came up with a report regarding the projection for human growth, and population growth. Now we have these basically areas or countries, 48 countries that are losing citizens, losing the number of citizens. So you have this really high pressure area and low pressure area in terms of population. The demography is changing. 48 countries, mostly in Europe and Japan and like Germany, are losing population. Their numbers dwindling, where Africa is producing half of the newborns around the world. So that imbalance in population growth will lead to greater drive to moving of people from one area, especially if it's deprived, like Africa versus Europe. So that is going to happen, and we have to deal with it. Like Mr. Fry said, that the best way to do is to create opportunities in these high population growth countries. So we need, to reduce this sort of illegal and the suffering of a lot of the migrants, and it reduces the need to build these walls, visible walls or invisible ones.
Thomas, what kind of impact does the construction of barriers have on, I guess, what we could call legitimate cross-border traffic? I mean, if we look at, say, the United States-Mexico border, it's one of the busiest crossing points, international crossing points in the world. What kind of an impact do these barriers create? I mean, there are lots of people, thousands of people crossing this border every day. If someone wants to get through illegally, they can get through, can't they?
Right. It really creates more of a mental barrier for most people. And it's very symbolic in that we created this dividing point, and so it channels traffic in different ways than it would normally flow. It's a hindrance to good commerce. So as far as an effective tool, it's effective to a certain degree, and I'm sure that the proponents of the wall will cite all kinds of statistics saying that it prevented this and that. It can be equally as beneficial taking a wall down. So the people that are in favor of taking a wall down can spin the argument just the opposite way. So this becomes a big political issue, and people are gaining lots of political favor by building walls, and other people in the future will gain political favor by taking them down. I think it's a cycle that we're going through right now. It's not going to be a long-term cycle. I think we have technologies that can do all the same things and be far less obtrusive and far less restrictive on our daily lives.
All right, Nali, speaking of politics getting involved in this, we just heard in our previous segment, the first part of the show, two of our guests there criticizing the Israeli construction of that wall, whereas the Israelis will tell you, look, there was a legitimate reason to create that wall, to build that barrier. It reduced terrorism. Does the criticism you heard in that first part, do they have a point?
I think maybe both sides have a point, really, because, as an Israeli government, what do? You tried everything, and then, that's one of the solutions you provided. Obviously, those people who are also building the wall, Israeli wall, they want to take advantage of this problem created in part by their policies and in part by Hamas attacks to force the Palestinians into a very bad situation. On the other side, too, I think there is sort of a refusal to recognize that if you are in the same position, you probably do the same. And I think walls are not the solutions. There are other ways. And the failure for both sides to reach some kind of I would say, standard of engagement between the two sides. That we can fight, but not bomb each other by planes or bomb each other's buses.
And that's where we have to leave it. Ali Al-Ahmed with me in the studio. Thomas Fry joining us from Denver. Thanks to both of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat, but the conversation continues online. Join us on CCTV America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter. You'll find that at CCTV_America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.